Battle against climate change. The latest from COP21, as we getting reports right now, is that the European Union has formed an alliance with 79 countries in a final dash for a deal. The new alliance has agreed to a common position on some of the aspects of the proposed draft that have been under contention for some time. They say that the Paris Agreement must be legally binding, inclusive and fair, and be reviewed every 5 years. The EU says that it will be willing to pay 475 million euros to support partner countries up to 2020. To discuss the likelihood of a deal being reached by Friday and its contours, and more importantly, India's role in that, I'm now joined by Prodipto Ghosh, former Environment Secretary and Distinguished Fellow at TERI, and Professor David Mond of Warwick University. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us tonight. Let me start with you, Mr. Prodipto Ghosh, because even before the Paris summit started, India has been trying to fight this perception battle. In fact, September, they released a 26-minute video on basically India's position, and you were quoted in the Telegraph during that time as saying that the Ministry of External Affairs was worried with the global perception of India. You would have seen, sir, the cartoon in the New York Times. Is India losing the perception battle in Paris? Mr. Ghosh, the question was for you. Is India losing the perception battle in Paris, sir?
Well, I think, this is a manufactured perception because, we had a couple of weeks ago, we had a report from a global civil society organizations which looked at the INDCs of different countries and gave an assessment of how well do they stack up with respect to their responsibilities, taking into account their levels of development and their historical responsibilities. And India was one of the very few countries which was very much on track in respect of its INDCs with respect to its responsibilities. But the same cannot be said of the United States or the European Union. They were just a fraction of what their legitimate obligations were. And so I think that the cartoon that you showed from the New York Times, that elephant actually should not be termed as India. That elephant should be termed as the US and the EU.
So you agree, sir, that therefore largely with India's position that while countries like South Africa, Brazil, India, many feel may have surprised the world by coming up with these ambitious emission cuts, the US could have done a lot more.
Both the US and the EU and all the other developed countries could have done much, much more.
Right. Comment on that, Professor Mond, because, what's the sense you're getting? You are in the UK, and UK will, of course, along with EU, will be playing a very important role if the world were to reach an agreement by the end of this week. What's the sense you're getting? By now, we more or less know where each country stands. Are these differences irreconcilable, or can there be a breakthrough?
Well, I believe that an agreement can be reached. What troubles me is the fact that currently there's no enforcement mechanism. The US has set its sights against having any enforcement, and I fear that without some enforcement, the agreement will just be a bunch of pieties about the need to avoid dangerous warming, but no mechanism for achieving that. But I'd just like to query your other interviewee's assertion about the assessment of India's INDC. Which international body are you referring to? Because the body that I've been checking with, which is this organization called Climate Action Tracker, has rated India's INDC as moderate, along with the US and the EU. At least it's better than many other countries which are rated as inadequate, and one has to admit that only 3 or 4 countries in the world are rated as sufficient. But I think it's not correct, at least according to the Climate Action Tracker, that India is doing any better than the US and the EU. Could you clarify this?
Right, absolutely. In fact, Mr. Ghosh, come in on that. I think that's a fair point that Professor Mond is saying, that the climate tracker is saying that it has categorized India along with US and EU, saying that the targets that India has come up with to reduce the carbon intensity by 2030 is only moderate.
Well, I think that the economic costs that have been evaluated by the Indian government and specified in the INDC is of the order of 2.5 trillion with a T. And considering that India's total GDP right now is of the order of 2 trillion, I don't see how anybody could characterize India's INDC as moderate. They need, to put on their thinking caps again.
Right. In fact, so we will come more specifically to the issues of funding. In fact, I'm going to pose that question to you, Prodipto Ghosh. But coming back to you, Professor Mond, I know that you, in fact, at the Warwick University, you also take a course which deals with game theory and climate change. So tell us, for our, for our ordinary viewers who may not know the nuances of game theory, how can game theory explain the fact that that so far the world has not reached or has not been able to break the climate impasse, and how will we reach the Nash equilibrium? I mean, if we were to use game theory language to basically break the deadlock by Friday.
Well, game theory comes up with some very simplified models of the ways that people behave in response to stimuli like economic gain, and those are games because they're models, but they can refer to some very serious circumstances. One of the most significant is called the prisoner's dilemma. Now, it's a bit difficult to explain this over the radio because you need to see some figures and to figure out what the figures imply. But let me assure your audience that if you analyze the prisoner's dilemma, in which two people are interrogated separately by the police, you find that if they operate entirely in their own interest, they come to a much worse outcome than if they operate according to a shared interest. So if they have confidence, if they can have faith in the other prisoners not breaking silence, they will do much better than if they decide to break silence in exchange for a reduced plea. So this is an example of where a Nash equilibrium, which is a situation in which no one can improve his own outcome through unilateral action, actually gives us a very bad collective outcome. It's very obvious. Everybody knows that if you're trying to make friends with somebody on a bus, when you meet a stranger, then you are engaged in a bit of small chit-chat and you build up confidence in one another. And you have to have this confidence in order to be able to move towards sharing your objectives. If you insist, as in the climate negotiations, on going only for your own private gain, then the result is that you make no progress. So I see us all as being trapped in a kind of malignant Nash equilibrium, which we're unable to leave because we're too hard-headed and we're not negotiating in a constructive way.
Right. Mr. Prodipto Ghosh, so far we've seen that a draft has been sort of agreed upon, which is about a 48, 49-page draft, and there it would appear that at least some of India's concerns have been addressed in that. How would you look at it, sir? I mean, going forward, and do you think from the 48-page draft we can have a shorter document which will sort of more or less address the 4 or 5 key concerns that India has been consistently raising?
Yes, before I come to that, let me briefly respond to this point about the Nash equilibrium. Resolving the prisoner's dilemma requires the protagonists to have trust in each other. Now, the fact of the matter is that over so many years of negotiations, trust has broken down because ultimately of the actions of the developed world in reneging from every one of their commitments, including their legal commitments starting from the 1992 Framework Convention Climate Change. And the present negotiations are being carried out under the UNFCCC, and what we see is a brazen attempt to rewrite the principles and the provisions of the convention. So in these circumstances, it is extremely difficult for one side to simply gain trust, to simply take the other's assertions on trust, when the evidence of some 25 years of negotiations shows that the other side never lives up to its side of the bargain. Now, coming to the issues, let me say that these are not Indian issues. These are issues common to almost all the developing world. And one is, of course, the whole issue of equity. And the point is that countries have to move forward with respect to their commitments on the basis of equity. Second of all, that there must be differentiation as given in the convention between the actions of developed and developing countries, and in particular developing countries, the action that they take are contingent on the provision of finance and technology and capacity building by the developed countries. That is part of the framework convention. Then, of course, there is differentiation in respect of in respect of reporting and accountability requirements and so on. And these are all there in the convention. And the point is that we see that not only is the developed world trying to rewrite the convention, but the developed world is going back explicitly on its commitments made in Copenhagen, in the political declaration of Copenhagen, for the provision of financial resources to developing countries of $100 billion a year.
Yes, sir. Yes, I mean, if you can just hold your thought there, Mr. Ghosh. Professor Mond, the larger point that many developing countries are making, is like if we purely go by statistics, and I know in one of your papers you've also said that how sort of, finding data on climate change can be quite challenging. But if we were to look at the data from 1850 onwards, we see that the share of US, EU, and some of the other more developed countries, their percentage in terms of carbon emission is far higher. US is about over 20% as compared to India's 2.8%. So clearly the point that India, along with other developing countries, is trying to say is that while looking into the future is perfectly fine, but we cannot overlook history. That is the key point on differentiation that is being made over and over again.
Yes, I agree. And I think these arguments carry a lot of validity, but so do the arguments put by the developed nations. I think that there are some irreconcilable differences here, and I'm afraid
believe there are irreconcilable differences, especially on the point of differentiation?
Yes, I fear there are. But I'd like to come back to something that Mr. Ghosh just mentioned. I heard him use the phrase 25 years of negotiations. I wonder, has he read a recent paper by in Nature suggesting a framework for negotiation, a paper by David Mackay and 3 others, which mentions this very figure, 25 years of negotiations, demonstrating that without enforcement, nothing will happen. Does he know this paper? It's an opinion piece.
I'll probably just... I'll probably just leave it to...
Let me respond to this.
Probably just listen. Yes, Mr. Ghosh, exactly. Respond to Professor there.
Yeah, on this question of enforcement, let me put it this way, that if all commitments of all countries were determined on the basis of equity, an agreed formulation of equity, then I think that the developing countries would have no objection to enforcement. And indeed, right now, the country which is most opposed to enforcement, and this has historically been the case over 25 years, is the United States. So I would suggest that you should address your comments to your colleagues across the Atlantic.
Right.
In the United States,
in fact, gentlemen,
when the US
quick last word, Professor, and then we need to wrap up. Please.
I will make them there. Yes, of course, I agree. Agreeing on equity is a very difficult matter.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so very much, gentlemen, for that engaging conversation. In fact, we will make it a point to have both of you back again, maybe once we know by Friday what the final contours of that Paris Agreement is. But thank you so very much for joining us on this debate on the big picture. Thanks so much.